Hey everybody, welcome to the MicroLecture for Chapter 14. This one's very brief. Most of what we're going to cover for the class is in this chapter, so definitely read through it. It talks about a lot of different types of technologies and how they're being used and how technology is managed. But I'm just going to give you a couple of things to think about when you think about information technology, whether you go into a career in it or not. Some things you have to think about. So our learning objectives are, you want to discuss the impacts of information technologies having on the business world. That's a broad objective. There's a lot of ways to answer that, but there's certainly things you have to think about. Identify the IT resources businesses have at their disposal and how these resources are used. Describe the role of information systems, the different types of information systems, and how businesses use such systems. So there's a lot of breadth of information there. Identify the threats and risks information technology poses to businesses, and they are many, and describe the ways in which businesses protect themselves from those threats and risks that information technology poses. So I'm going to give you a real brief overview of it just so you get a sense of where I'm coming from. When I started in business, there was some very basic mainframe computing going on that had some very basic programming languages such as COBOL and Fortran, and there's much different other types of things like that. And I learned all those things by punching data onto data cards. It wasn't even directly inputted into these data storage systems at the time. So it's just amazing how much things have changed over that period of time, and just how computing's done and and different ways that we found to use it. So one of the challenges I have for you is to think about how do you anticipate the technologies that are coming along, and how do you anticipate which ones you're going to have to assimilate and make part of what you're going to do for your particular line of work. That's not an easy question to answer, and you have to think about how quickly do you adopt new technologies and things like that. It's a challenge. In and of itself, it's a challenge. Obviously, there's some really famous stories of people who did not jump on the e-commerce internet bandwagon very early, and they were playing catch up and never necessarily survived or recovered, and it affected their survival. So that's just one kind of high-profile view of it, but you can look at it across the board. There's lots and lots of different ways to think about that. But the only thing I can tell you is that there is definitely more technology out there available for organizations to take on and adopt than there is time and resources to make that happen. So you have to be selective. You have to decide what you're going to do first and what you're not going to do at all. And it's a real challenge. I can tell you that from a management perspective. Okay. And we've created a whole management structure within organizations called information technology or information technology services. You'll see all different types of different names on it, but they're basically there to integrate and keep running technologies that help the organization do what it is that they do. And I worked very closely with them over decades and decades, and I came to really appreciate the people that I was dealing with. And one of the best guys I knew, he was the chief information officer of a corporation that I worked for, and he was not above poking fun at his profession. And so when we said, well, we need to do this technology piece, and we're gonna go down this path and integrate this type of technology, and his very first question always was, what's the TLA for that? And he was not being serious. He was saying that very tongue in cheek. But people would go like, what do you mean TLA? He's like, TLA, 3-letter acronym. And then it's so funny. The funny part, obviously, is TLA is a 3-letter acronym. So it's really common in IT. So you see it all over, and it's so funny. In what he said, and after he said that, first off I laughed, and then the second thing I thought it was like, this is true. Technology loves 3-letter acronyms. So MIS, CRM, CPU, ERP, VDT, RAM. I don't even know how long this list is, but it's huge. And even a whole company is a 3-letter acronym called IBM. It's just amazing stuff, but fun. Uh, Now this graphic I think is really, really helpful. So I'm going to zoom in on this guy just a little bit if I can. Okay, all right. And the reason why I think it's helpful is that it shows how technologies change. And one of the bellwether, or the ways that you can think about measuring that is over these decades, is the cost to store data. And we don't even think about it today. Today it's like a non-factor. There's what cost? What's the big deal, right? And it isn't very high cost. But you go back to the early days of computing. This is more in my time when we had these mainframe computers and things were stored on. Quite often they were stored. One of the first things was a reel tape. It was like magnetic tape on a reel. And the cost for storage back then was $373 per kilobyte. Now, a lot of you probably don't even know what a kilobyte is, but because you might think of like the smallest things, a megabyte. It's like, well, no, there's 1,000 kilobytes in a megabyte, so that gives you some idea what was involved here. So back then, it was really, really expensive to store data. Okay, so that was a big deal. And as we progressed, that dropped down to 175 per kilobyte back in the say like the 1980s. You can see how the spending on IT was really, really starting to skyrocket at that point. And then you go back into the 90s, and we saw the price per kilobyte go down to 6 cents, from $373 to 6 cents per kilobyte back in the 90s. And computing really was changing then. We were going to distributed computing networks, things like that. And the internet was starting to be adapted and used. Ultimately, it's the World Wide Web was developed and used. Okay, so and then we go over, and the huge IT thing happened right here was right when we switched over to the new millennium. There were all these dire predictions of massive IT failure and shutdowns and things like that. Y2K was the 3-letter acronym put on that one. Okay, so but yeah, it was a real problem, and that everybody anticipated was going to be there, and it wasn't. And most of the work that needed to be done was done well before the actual start of the new millennium. But then we started getting into portable computing, smartphones. Those are very new things, right? So as phone usage proliferated, people were developing apps and all different kinds of things, and you can see the cost to store data here. This is just amazing. Went down to 0.003 cents per kilobyte. Okay, and then going after the year 2010, we saw lots of other types of technologies come along. But the one last thing I want to show you here is that the cost to store data was 0.00095 cents per kilobyte. So it's just amazing how much that's changed. So, and we're continuing to invest heavily into IT and IT infrastructure, and it shows how things have really changed and evolved over time. Now, so what I was saying before was the challenge was in 1980s, or let's just say in the 1990s, should we have been jumping on mobile at that point? Should we have been saying, like, okay, we got to develop something for mobile usage of computing, of our systems and that kind of thing? The progressive companies obviously jumped on that. Some of the other ones, not so progressive, kind of scrambled after the fact. But it doesn't always make sense for you to be the first mover on these things. And again, I think that's a really important takeaway you can bring from this. Last thing I want to talk about in IT security is really a big deal and a really big one to consider getting into if you are going into that area. So one of my favorite little, I love Dilbert. I'll be the first one who's a big fan of Dilbert. I think it's very insightful and funny at the same time. Very maybe a cynical view of how modern office environment. So there's a guy who works in the organization MORDAC. He's the preventer of information services, and he says security is more important than usability. In a perfect world, no one would be able to use anything. There's got to be times that you feel like that, right? It's like, how come I'm the only one that can't get into my account? I mean, every hacker can, but I can't. I was like, go figure, right? And so to complete, and then the last one is, the maliciousness of the people who are internet security. Yet, having said that, the security of information and the protection of information systems has become a very big deal. There's a huge amount of liability attached to it, and the companies can go down for weeks at a time. Most recently here in the Chicago area, a large group of hospitals called Ascension Group had their systems hacked, and it just brought their systems to a screeching halt. And I mean, you can even make doctor's appointments and things like that. So this is a really big area and a really important part of IT. And again, if it's a field you want to get into, I know several people have gotten into it recently, and it's almost like you're never without a challenge, and you're always working. All right, so that's my brief micro lecture for IT, and so if you have any questions, certainly let me know.